Welcome back to the Chem-Chem Talk Show with your hosts, Leok and Treble Clef Nodi.
Thank you, Mike. Now, what are we talking about today, Leok?
Today, we are learning about chemicals. More specifically, can your breaths reveal the emotional tone of a movie?
And to answer that question, we have a special guest.
An atmospheric chemist who studies the chemical makeup of the air around us. He works at the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry. Please welcome Gaston Wiltegraf.
Thank you for being on the show today, Mr. Wiltegraf.
It's my pleasure, TC, and you can just call me Gaston.
Well, Gaston, we've heard you've done an experiment on this very question.
Why, yes, I have. Would you like to share your findings with our audience? Why, yes, I would. After conducting several tests, we've discovered that scientists can, in fact, figure out a movie's emotional tone from the chemicals made from gasps of its audience. Wow! And how did you come to that conclusion? Well, movies have different chemicals they produce depending on the emotional tone. My co-workers and I measured air samples collected over 6 weeks in 2 movie theaters.
And how many people was that?
Well, 9,500 moviegoers watched 16 films, and that included a mix of comedy, romance, action, and horror films. Would you care to show us the results? Of course. As you see here, this graph shows sections of the CO2 data measured in the air from the main Sinister cinema. In Figure 1A, large CO2 peaks can be observed between 26th and 30th December, each corresponding to the screening of a particular film. Figure 1B shows CO2 measurements and audience numbers for a day on which 4 films were screened: Hunger Games 2, Dinosaurs 3D, and Buddy, twice. Those films with higher attendance have correspondingly higher CO2. Figure 1C displays the CO2 profile of a single film, Hunger Games 2. Clearly, the CO2 trace does not increase smoothly with time, as would be expected from a constant emission source, but rather small peaks are discernible despite the cinema ventilation rate remaining constant. Suspenseful moments showed upticks in CO2 and isoprene, a chemical associated with the tensing of muscles. Every emotional type had its own chemical composition, so you could track the emotions of the moviegoers just by looking at the chemicals in their breath. Wow, what compelling data!
Indeed, thank you for sharing.
My pleasure.
I do have a question regarding the experiment.
Ask away.
What about chemicals that weren't from people's gasps, like perfume and shampoo?
To keep the result as accurate as possible, we had to account for chemicals that had no link to on-screen action.
Fascinating.
Oh, we're almost done, but we do have time for one more question. I'm sure all viewers are wondering, what can we do with this brand new information? Well, we need more data to make stronger links between human emotions and what's in their breath. However, companies could potentially use this in the future. They could quickly measure the air during tests to see how people feel about their new products. Astounding! Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you again to our wonderful guest. Thank you, Lyric and TC, for inviting me onto the show. I enjoyed sharing my data.
And thank you, viewers, for watching the show. Come back next week for another episode of
The Chem-Chem Talk Show.